I am with the Institute for Transformative Technologies. As you can imagine, we work on technologies we consider transformative. And the question is, what does that mean? And that's what I'll talk about. A couple of years back, actually, almost 18 months back, we released a study. We call it the 50 Breakthroughs study. Around the time of the run-up to the Sustainable Development Goals, there's a question of how can science and technology help. So we looked at all the issues affecting the global poor and essentially asked the question, what are the most important science and technology breakthroughs required to address these problems? And that study is a 658-page behemoth. The wonderful news is that I have copies sitting outside. If you want to take them, the even better news is that rather than kill trees and print hard copies, we have them on a thumb drive. And you can grab them with you as you go out. Let me begin with something I have in a pocket. And the reason I'm showing you this is I stuck my hand in my pocket and just happened to find it. But also, you've gotten a sneak peek of what this is. This is a grain of maize, corn, a humble grain of maize. And the reason I'm showing it to you is that this constitutes pretty much the only food for hundreds of millions of the rural poor in sub-Saharan Africa, to some extent in South Asia as well. And the reason I'm showing you this is the following. Where does this come from? Good answer. In principle, it comes from this cob. Right? Where does this cob come from? This lovely, lush farm. And where does this lovely, lush farm come from? And where do these individual crops come from? They come from the earth. And the thing is that there's a lot that goes into actually pulling this thing out of the ground. If you think about the Amazon forest, if you think of all the forests in the world, trees grow by themselves without human intervention. Yet, in agriculture, we seem to need a lot of interventions. And why is that? Simply because we extract more from the ground than the ground is capable of giving. And so this thing requires this unpleasant but absolutely essential thing called fertilizer. And the thing about fertilizer, which, I mean, engineers probably know this, but a little-known fact outside the engineering community is that virtually 100% of the fertilizer in the world comes from a single chemical process. It's called the Haber-Bosch process. And Haber and Bosch, two German chemists, both won the Nobel Prize for their work. And this was in the 50s and 60s. And at this point, most of the world, and I say most because I'll tell you there are parts of the world that don't have access to this, most of the world uses this kind of chemical fertilizer for growing crops. Now, what does it take to actually make fertilizer using the Haber-Bosch process? It takes this. Enormous factories costing a lot of money. So to build a single factory to make fertilizer probably costs in excess of $250 million US. And as you can imagine, that kind of money isn't available easily. And so what happens is by the time fertilizer is produced in the countries where it's made and shipped to the typical African port city, not to the hinterland, but the port city, it already costs 50% more than it would cost a middle-class farmer in Europe or the United States. So what does this farmer do? She does not have access to fertilizer. So what has happened in Africa over the decades is what's called extensification. Farmers use a plot of land, which gives what it can give, and then they have to move on to another plot of land. And what happens when they move on to another plot of land? Eventually, they run into forests, and that leads to deforestation. So this problem absolutely needs to be solved. And how do we solve it? What are the parameters of this problem? Well, certainly, you can't have lots of factories costing $250 million in Africa. Guess how many there are today? How many factories making fertilizer are there in sub-Saharan Africa today, if you ignore South Africa?
40?
0. Okay. And so in the absence of money, in the absence of the kind of infrastructure it takes to build fertilizer factories, how do we solve this problem? I don't know. Is this rocket science? I posit that it's actually harder. Remember, 2 Nobel Prizes went into this. And I suspect that whoever comes up with an alternative to this deserves another one. Now, there are some interesting ideas about using things like human waste. Now, all of us know that animal waste is often used for fertilizer, but what about human waste? Let's look at the possibilities here. And there are a number of small NGOs actually converting waste into fertilizer, and it's actually a really good thing to do, but will it actually solve the problem of food security? Now, for every 1 grain of maize, we need 1 more to really address food security in Africa. So if you look at Kenya, and Kenya being among the more sort of innovative, the more strongly emerging economies in Africa, what would it take to double food production? Well, let's look at, let's consider human waste. Now, the problem with considering human waste, besides the obvious, is that most of the human waste is actually deposited outside. It's not going into sewer systems. It's not going into actual toilets connected to anything remotely looking like an infrastructure. It is outdoors. And so imagine now, let's go into the theoretical world and say, fine, instead of less than 0.1% of the waste which is currently collected in a sewer system, let's assume that 100% of it is actually collected and converted to fertilizer with only theoretical losses. What then? Well, it turns out that if you did that, if you actually took all the human waste, all the fecal matter and the urine, converted it with only theoretical losses to fertilizer, you get only a 25% boost in food production, and particularly of cereals. So how do you solve this problem? I don't know. I don't have the answer, but that's the purpose of the 50 Breakthrough Study, is to actually give our community a set of challenges to work on. There are some interesting emerging solutions that look at natural processes for nitrogen fixation, as ribosomes and such, and they're trying to replicate that. It's not clear whether it'll work or not. But that's the kind of breakthrough we need to address the problem of this magnitude. Now, the study itself covers a lot of topics: food security, health, education, human rights, gender equity, electricity, water, climate change, and environmental damage. And the methodologies include, a lot of hard data sciences, a lot of historical work into why some of these problems haven't been solved, a lot of primary field research, and it's become a little bit of a roadmap for our institute. And so what we are trying to do is gradually take on these breakthroughs and figure out a way to make them come to life. And the way we do it is the following. So this is the study that you'll find on your thumb drive outside. And one of the things we do is plot it on a timeline. Each of these 50 breakthroughs, how long will it take to come to life? Is it a couple of years away? Will it happen on its own? So, Dr. Mo Ibrahim talked about smartphones. You can imagine, because of such high market demand, smartphones, low-cost smartphones, will actually be coming to the market fairly soon. But some others, like an alternative to the Haber-Bosch process, like vaccines for HIV/AIDS, effective vaccines for malaria, these will take a very, very long time to come. And so what we do is focus on the things, on the breakthroughs that need a long time, 5 years, 10 years, and figure out a way to accelerate their time to market. And the way we do it, I'll use the example of India, which is where I'm from. So these are some of the challenges, social and environmental challenges affecting India. I won't go through the laundry list, but you can imagine they are a lot of the same problems we hear about in other developing countries. And this is the list of technologies required to address these problems. Again, I won't bore you with the details. The point is that there is this list. And now, what do we do with this list? We map it on this two-dimensional framework. So one is the type of R&D required. Is it the kind of research and the kind of R&D that's available to the private sector in emerging markets? Is it restricted to government labs in emerging markets? Or is it only in advanced labs in the US and EU? And I use that phrase EU very delicately. The second question is, how attractive is it to the market? Is it something that a global multinational company would find profitable? Is it something that companies in emerging markets would find profitable? Or is it something just simply doesn't have any economic, that doesn't hold any economic interest to companies? And if you plot that in this frame, our focus is on things, on technologies for which there is advanced research required, the kind of research that's not typically present in emerging markets, but can be of economic interest to companies in emerging markets. I sometimes refer to this as the Viagra problem. And the reason I call it the Viagra problem is the following. As you can imagine, there is a vast market for something like Viagra in the Western world, in the industrialized world. Yet, there isn't an effective malaria vaccine. Why is that? It's because not many people in the industrialized world die of malaria. Yet, there is large demand for something like Viagra. And so if there were these technologies sitting in a research lab somewhere, maybe intended for a different purpose altogether, our job is to figure out a way to source that and then build it out and try and take it to market. And I'll give you a couple of examples. And we work with research labs all over the world, and it's national labs, it's universities, not necessarily restricted to the Western world, often with startups and individual inventors as well. And then we also work with established institutions, and I emphasize the phrase established, because to take things to scale, you really need, you need companies and organizations that have staying power. So one example of that is the Tata group of companies in India, Nairobi Women's Hospital in Kenya. And this is one example. Now, coming back to the issue of human waste and getting rid of human waste, we all know that lack of sanitation is one of the major problems affecting the poor. It is, I believe, the fourth largest cause of death among children under the age of 5. I think it kills somewhere north of 700,000 children every year. And while there isn't enough money to build the kind of sewer infrastructure that is required to get rid of this waste, and honestly, most planners, most urban planners in particular, today would rethink that kind of central infrastructure. So the question is there an off-grid mechanism to get rid of human waste? There is a British biochemist, we'll come back to that biochemist in just a moment, who figured out a way to use earthworms to get rid of the waste. The mechanism is as powerful as it is simple. This biochemist figured out a way. Turns out that while earthworms can thrive in things like cow dung, human waste is too dense, and so it becomes anaerobic, and worms don't survive in human waste. So this biochemist figured out a way to build a digester with multiple layers, so that the worms can actually live and thrive in an ecosystem that without direct exposure to the waste, and they go eat the stuff and come back. And to date, we've got 1,300 toilets using this technology installed in India. So when a family of 4 uses a toilet, guess how long it takes for the waste to completely disappear? 2 hours. Turns out that worms love this stuff. Who knew? And then the other question is, so people use it every day, and guess how long it can go without needing cleaning. So as you can imagine, if human waste goes into a pit, it builds up. So recognizing that they'll be built up, guess how long you have to go without cleaning? Turns out it's actually 8 years. So imagine a toilet that can go 8 years without cleaning. No smell, no flies. The users are very, very happy with this. We've barely scratched the surface with 1,300 toilets. We're working hard to get this up to tens of thousands and hundreds of thousands. So we're working closely with the Tata group of companies, and in India, it turns out there's a really powerful subsidy program for this. It's called the Swachh Bharat program. Coming back to the biochemist, he is actually sitting in this room. Walter Gibson, take a bow. His work is very inspiring. Another quick example, and this one's actually funded by DFID and the EPSRC, so thank you for the funding. Thank you, the British government. This is a typical clinic this happens to be in Pakistan. Those beds you see, a woman gave birth on one of those beds just a few days before I took the photograph. What you see in the corner is a toilet, and that is not connected to anything, doesn't have running water. And as you can imagine, you probably get more diseases going into the toilet, coming out of the toilet than you had going into it. That cabinet has things like vaccines. Vaccines have to be refrigerated. And these vaccines have been sitting in that cabinet for months in very high temperatures. And this is an aid-funded clinic. So in this context, how do you actually provide solid health care? As you can imagine, this is, giving birth in a place like that is not healthy. And turns out that there's a saying, the single most dangerous thing you can do if you're an African woman is give birth. And so what we're doing under this EPSRC grant is figuring out what kind of a clinic system you need. So just, I'll quickly walk through this analysis just to give you a sense of the methodology we used in the 50 breakthroughs. It turns out that to build a clinic with the appropriate equipment, you need over $100,000 US, right? Basic equipment to run a clinic. And so what we did was run the economic analysis to say, if a clinic has to break even in 5 years, what's the expense like? What has to go into making it self-sustaining in a 5-year period? Turns out that the maximum allowable cost is $25,000 US. So that's the kind of analysis we did to identify the parameters for the breakthroughs. And this project is kicking off. In fact, even as I speak, my colleagues in Kenya are actually planning to pilot V1 of this. So we call this technology a clinic in a box, or the 500-watt clinic, so it can operate off-grid. Today, we are launching the 50 Breakthroughs website. And so all the material that you have on the thumb drive is now on this website, hopefully easy to read. It talks about the purpose, the methodology, the actual breakthroughs, and the heat maps that tell you how long it'll take, what are the complexities involved, and so on and so forth. These are the categories covered. And so, as you go through it, it says, what are the things you need to know about each of these areas? What are the challenges involved? What are the important data points you have to understand to solve this problem? And then the actual breakthroughs. For access to electricity, turns out you need 5 or 6 fairly critical breakthroughs. Now, we also look at, once the breakthrough happens, what's it going to take it to market. Obviously, there are plenty of great technologies sitting on the shelf, so building a technology isn't enough. It's important to figure out how to actually make it come to life. There are 2 other things worth noting. One is, if you have an innovation, you can submit it to this website, and we'll have panels of experts evaluating it and saying, is this really a breakthrough? Is it a clever innovation that will help but falls short of a breakthrough? Or is it none of the above? We'll also be creating a forum for people to connect to each other. So imagine an engineer in Kenya asking a question to peers sitting in India or Bangladesh or Kenya or the US. And so we're hoping to create a thriving ecosystem for conversations among peers. So the purpose of this website is, and our whole effort is to hold ourselves to a higher bar. We've been privileged to have a great education in STEM. And we have to do better than build the next Pokemon Go. So this is a modest effort. I'm sure there are other institutions also working towards this, and I'm looking forward to working with you to make this happen. Thank you.